Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Peter Roff. I'm a contributing editor at Newsweek magazine. I write in the opinion section. I also do columns for the Daily Caller, and I'm syndicated through the cable network. It's a pleasure to be here, moderating again as a transatlantic member media fellow. I think that the work that we do promoting the idea of press freedom and First Amendment values is understood in the United States in particular and in the West generally are an invaluable service to our journalistic colleagues across the world. Some of them do not have the luxury of the liberties that we are protected by, both by law and custom. Today, our topic is responsible journalism in the age of distorted and fake news. And I find it a little bit ironic that I am hosting this panel, considering that when I started my career, I was considered by some of my colleagues to be a fake journalist, because I had made the transition from actively working in the political arena to covering politics, kind of like Terry Bradshaw going from the Pittsburgh Steelers to Fox Sports. Well, he's a lot bigger than I am, but I have more hair. It's a challenging endeavor to try to be fair and to be honest. And that responsibility on the news side is even more important than it is on the opinion side, although it exists on the opinion side too, where we cannot be allowed to use the license we have to share our personal thoughts and turn it into an excuse to deceive our readers, our viewers, and our listeners. We're gonna go from my left to my, if you'll forgive the expression, Abderrahim Foukara left. On the panel this afternoon, I'd like each of my panelists to introduce themselves and to tell you what they think is important about themselves and to speak just for a little minute so you'll get to know them. And then my plan is I would like us all to engage in a conversation rather than a stop and go kind of presentation, because I'd much rather play traffic cop than orchestra conductor. I think it's a lot more fun for me, and I think it's a lot more fun for the people who are watching at home and for you that are in the room. And as always, if you have a question, please don't wait till you think we're finished. Put your hand up and we'll call on you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dustin Siggins to introduce himself.
Thanks, Peter. So my name is Dustin Siggins. I'm with Proven Media Solutions. I was a journalist, made the transition to the other side of the table, so I no longer report on fake news. I give the journalists the fake news to report. And so what I want to ask, and I'm not going to get too much into it now, I think we'll probably have an organic conversation in a little bit, is what is the definition of distorted or fake news? The title here says in the age of. If you went back 50 and a half years, some people might say Roe v. Wade was a case that looked at what is the definition of life? Is it not a life? Is it women's rights? Is it the baby's rights? How you report on that 50 years ago could have been argued as fake news. We just didn't have social media to tell people how to fight about it. And so I think an important question to tie into this overall panel discussion is, how do you report accurately when people don't agree on terms, but also people don't agree on what something is, which goes back, back to yellow journalism 150 years ago. So I want to make sure we're also focusing this discussion not just on the last 8 years or social media or AI, but also the overall concept of accuracy in the press. So that's where I'm going to try to focus the conversation. The three people further to my left, both I think politically, but also geographically, we'll probably be able to discuss that more in depth, since I'm focusing more on the hack side, and they're on the real journalism side.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I spent 4 years and 8 months at the White House's VOA's either senior correspondent or bureau chief. So I was there for the basically the entire Trump administration, first 8 months of the Biden administration. I had covered coming back to the U.S. in 2016, the last 8 months of the Obama administration, not covering the White House, though I was traveling mostly with John Kerry as he was racking up his government frequent flyer miles at the end of that administration. But I'm basically a foreign correspondent for most of my career. I say I'm ABC, Asia but China, not ABC News. So I know just enough about China that you really shouldn't ask me about China. So for me, coming back to the United States in 2016 was a real eye-opener. I had been out of the country for an entire generation. And when I returned, perhaps I was naive, but I was really surprised to see that a lot of people, including members of my own family, could not discern between a well-researched Wall Street Journal piece, for example, and some piece of disinformation that a friend had posted on Facebook. And that was a revelation, a real eye-opening moment for me, that no matter how hard we try to be, objective and research our stories, that there was a substantial percentage of the audience that couldn't tell. The problem was not us necessarily, but a lack of news literacy. And if I hadn't been working for VOA, if I had been working for a domestic commercial news outlet, I think I might have quit the business and gone off to try to teach news literacy, although that may have been a chaotic quest. But I still feel strongly about it, that is a significant problem in our society and maybe in other societies as well. And I just, one other comment I'll add. I sort of have disdain now for both the phrases fake news and breaking news. Everything is breaking news, so it's meaningless. And fake news is just an epithet thrown out there for news that people don't like or do not want to confront. And then distortion we can talk about here is much more of a subjective matter, but something legitimate. Kerry?
Again, my name is Kerry Picket. I'm a senior congressional reporter at the Washington Times. Before I came to Washington, I was working in the entertainment news business. I worked at Viacom and at MTV as a production assistant there. I wrote up a lot of the sort of a jingle type of news. Watch out, Britney Spears is coming your way. You don't want to miss this. So lots of kind of fun stuff. But the fact is, even though it's entertainment news, you have to get the news right, regardless. But I didn't want to go back into, or not even back, but I didn't want to go into hard news. So I came to Washington and started working for a lot of hard news outlets, and I eventually ended up at the Washington Times. Now, that being said, one of the things that concerns me, particularly when it comes to the idea of misinformation, which is the carrying on of information which is not true, disinformation, which is putting forth information that you know is not true, and then the idea of the phrase that you said, fake news, which you don't like. Still, I don't like the idea that you have government trying to put forth consequences because they don't like what's out there. Because now we are seeing social media, which was being sort of regulated from government And we are seeing court cases that are being litigated right now as to whether or not government is going to be sort of dealing with that. Right now, the court case is being dealt with right now. So the question is, should government be dealing with news? And should the news that they don't like be regulated by them through the social media platforms? That's a question here that has to be dealt with, because can government say, no, sorry, that's fake news, and we don't want it on the media platforms, and we're just going to tell the media platforms, oh, we're just going to bring out Section 230 here, and we're going to end up threatening you with that. That's something that we're probably going to have to talk about here, because government is in a situation that's sort of hanging over our heads with the issue of fake news.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Sasha. Thanks to Len for taking me part of this event. My name is Abderrahim Foukara. I'm the Bureau Chief of Jazeera here in Washington. I've been with Jazeera for some 20 years now. And before that, I worked briefly for public radio in Boston and for allafrica.com here in DC. Allafrica.com is supposed to be the largest provider of African news and analysis. And before that, I worked for several years for BBC World Service Radio in London. The question that I have is not just what is fake news. I totally agree with you. The other question I have is what is responsible journalism? Circling back to my experience with BBC in London, obviously BBC has, throughout its 70 or 80 years of existence, it's built up a huge capital of credibility. But it has to be said also that at the root of the experience, the BBC was basically set up to counter Nazi propaganda. And so initially it was doing British propaganda as opposed to German propaganda. But it went on from that to build, as I said, a huge capital of credibility. And it has fought a lot of battles. It fought a nasty battle with Margaret Thatcher during the Falklands War, because Thatcher wanted the BBC to say our troops instead of just the British troops. And she threatened to cut off funding for the organization. Recently, as we all know, it has been fighting a battle against those who wanted to describe Hamas as a terrorist organization, and those who are saying it's not the role of the BBC to describe, to attach an epithet like that to any news organization. And then that brings me to the issue of how the American networks have covered, for example, the war so far between Israel and Hamas. And if you ask a lot of Americans, they'll say that the coverage of CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and so on, that is conventional television, has been doing it right. But you talk to a lot of other Americans and they say, no, these networks have been doing a lot of pro-Israel propaganda. So that leaves the question of what is responsible journalism, who describes a particular type of journalism as responsible or irresponsible. The one thing we know for sure, regardless what you think about conventional television in the US, the one thing we know for sure is that social media, which you talked about, as a very important point. Social media have proven themselves to be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, again, I circle back to this intense, nasty debate even in the US about what's going on between Israel and Hamas. There's obviously a lot of propagandizing on social media. There's a lot of fake news, there's a lot of fake pictures, there's a lot of, for both sides. But there's also a large segment of Americans, particularly young Americans, from different backgrounds, whether they're Arab, Jewish, African American, or otherwise, who are increasingly saying that they are finding out more about the Middle East, not from responsible American television, but from social media. And so those are the two basic premises that I wanted to put forth. What is responsible journalism, and who should control social media, particularly for those people who say that they rely on it to find out the true nature of what's going on around the globe, but at this particular time, in particular between Israel and Hamas. And I'll leave it at that, thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your introductory remarks, and I've been asked to remind you as best you can to grab the microphone and talk into it, because the folks who are watching online are having trouble hearing you. But I think that you've just gotten 4 very important descriptions of the issues involved in a larger discussion of responsible journalism and fake news. That remind me of the story of the blind men who are asked to describe an elephant, and each describes a part of the elephant without describing the whole thing. But putting it all together, and I'll start with you, Steve. What responsibility do we have as journalists to consider how our reporting might be misused or used in an irresponsible manner to further somebody else's objective?
I think that's inevitable. It's going to happen, and you can't spend all day worrying about that because people will take up one line out of your story. You can have the most nuanced 1,400 word or 20-minute documentary, and they'll extract one sentence out of it and try to beat you up with that. So I really don't think you can worry too much about that, because especially where things are going out on social media and being distorted, it is going to happen. And people also, depending on where the funding is coming from for your particular news organization or its perceived political bent, are going to look at everything through that particular prism, and then of course it's put through their own sunglasses, rose-colored or other colored sunglasses, to come to their own conclusions about your reporting. But
So you should be saying, as practitioners, we're responsible, we have a responsibility, we know where our standards are, and we put it out there, and what happens, happens. Kerry, do you agree?
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, same as what you just mentioned, people will go into my articles and they'll pick out probably their favorite graph there, and then they'll end up saying, okay, well, I'm just gonna push this out on Twitter and then make their own comment on it. But that is just going to be just natural with the dissemination of information that's been going on for decades now. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that will always happen with distortion of media, because with all of our articles, there are different parts to our articles. There are different interest points in our articles. Sometimes people will take certain parts of our articles and will certainly distort them. And then sometimes they'll take parts of our articles that they very much do understand, and they understand them quite well, and they put them out there in a way that we actually meant for them to be put out there. So I think it just kind of depends.
Although, yes, but I just want to say that what you just said, Kerry, brought me back to my political days when we used to complain. The reporters and camera crews would come in and talk to you for an hour and a half and they'd use 30 seconds. So I think that the same thing that you're talking about in terms of how our product gets used, that we are ourselves vulnerable to that kind of criticism, that we cherry pick sometimes in an effort to drive a story. And sometimes I will say, as an opinion writer, sometimes I recognize that I'm doing that, sometimes I don't. You know, we are human beings and we're capable of making mistakes, but again, I have the luxury of being in the opinion section, and if I write something that I believe to be true and can defend, I'm okay with it. I don't set out to set the objective of, you know, this is the message I want to send. Is that a conversation?
Hey, Peter, I gotta interject, you were very lucky to get 30 seconds. If you look at network news, sound bites sometimes are 4 to 6 seconds long.
Yeah, I mean, the issue obviously has so many different facets. Let me just focus on one. You've just touched on it, Peter, opinion. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know. Let me not be judgmental, fortunately or unfortunately, but we live in an age where traditional journalism, which was basically guided by clear principles of what you should do, what you should say, and how you should say it, and what even your body language on television should be like. I think more and more people don't like that kind of journalism. More and more people find it boring and tedious. And there's no place on the face of the planet where that problem is so acute than here in the United States. I mean, you take the BBC or you take NPR or such similar organizations which still use the old-fashioned metrics of journalism. Yes, we have a lot of Americans who listen to them, but they are still niche markets. Whereas people tend to move towards a different type here in the US and around the globe, which is opinion journalism. The journalist, reports what he thinks is the reality, something that others may regard as fake news, but it's an audience grabber. And that's a reality that we have to contend with. And you come to social media, and obviously those limits, they don't exist. Everyone has become a journalist. And look, be careful what you wish for. There was a time when we were all wishing for the world to become more democratic. And the world has become more democratic in the sense that everyone now with an iPhone has an opinion and can say whatever they want to say, and it's up to you whether you're going to accept it as scripture and believe it, or you're going to say this is fake news. But that's the reality of the world where we live today. It's a democratic world, but it's a cacophonic world. Anybody can say just anything, and there's nobody but yourself most of the time to guide you as to whether you should believe it or you should take it with a mine of salt. Most of the time, the stuff that on social media, you should take it with a mine of salt, if you ask my opinion.
So one of the things that, I want to tell a path. I want to start on one end of the path, and I'm going to start from the other end. So I'm going to take a kind of a 50,000 foot view. There was a video showing CNN reporters, or excuse me, camera crew, dodging Hamas missiles, and there was an overload, a voice telling them to fake it. Is anyone familiar with this video that went out about 2 weeks ago? And it was used on social media to show that CNN is so biased, they were having their camera crew pretend on the orders of somebody on the phone to be running away from missiles and dodging. I looked at that and I said, that might fit some of my political bias. We do a Google search, and about 5 minutes later I found a Reuters article, we fact checked it, which linked to the site that said, yes, we did the voiceover, that was us, not CNN, we're just trying to prove a point. So the first part of the path is from me as the media consumer, no longer in the journalism world, the PR hat world, I try to tell them what I think is important, or my clients think is important, is I think we have a responsibility to double check when we see something online that fits our narrative, right? Maybe it's the fake story of the parent tearing apart a classroom over gender issues. Maybe it's the story of the woman in New York City by Karen who allegedly at 6 months pregnant tried to jump over somebody to get a bike and confronting 4 young men. We find a story that fits our biases, we probably have a responsibility as a consumer to double check. First of all, do we care enough to even get involved in it? Second of all, can we make a difference? Third, let's double check. If we can't find the facts, we don't have the time to wait 2 days. I have found that waiting 48 hours, the facts generally come out, like the Fox News story earlier this year about homeless veterans being kicked out of a hotel for housing for immigrants. That was a big story at the local level, and local news found it, got reported on the chain. So that's the consumer side. I think on the journalist side, there are tons of media biases, and it's not just political, it's not just domestic versus international, it's not just age. I suspect another than maybe everybody else on the panel. At the same time, there's word counts. There are platforms. Are you radio? Are you TV? Are you an opinion journalist? Are you a straight news text journalist? There are all sorts of media biases that come into account. And so I do think on the journalism side, it's been hurt by the desire to get clickbait so that you can break the news, right? It's always breaking news on voting night about every little update on the tick board on the back of on the screen. I'm sorry, I'll wrap up in just a moment. Long and the short is I do think there is a challenge on the news side where we all have our subconscious biases, or maybe we want to report something from this perspective to teach the audience something, or have them leave something out that we think is less important. And I think we just have to be really careful not to let the concerns, like you said, about is it really going to matter when everyone's moving so quickly? I think journalists still have a basic duty to put those facts out there, even if they're not sexy, even if they are going to get ignored today, because they build that credibility when everyone else flames out.
I mean, the question that I have for you on that, do you think the question that I had about that for you, do you think that these changes that you just described now, do you think they are the result of a change in human nature? People, they just want something fast, and they don't want traditional journalism because it's too slow, or is this about money? You have to do the kind of journalism, whether on TV or in social media, that actually gets you money. That's the bottom line.
I think it's probably 3 factors, though if anyone wants to call it 4 or 1, I'm not gonna have a hard opinion on that one. I think it's 3 factors. One is human nature, right? And it's well known whether it's on anything that is addictive, social media, right? It gets you outraged. You're gonna share it more. Or if you're really happy about it, fits your bias, and you think it's good, you're gonna share it more. So I think part of it's just human nature being exacerbated or exposed through social media. Therefore, I think journalism has changed in response to that, the financial incentives. And there was a third point, but I skipped my head, so I'll come back to it later.
Well, we have a question in the audience here.
Yes.
Right
Do
down
you
there.
hear me well?
I can, but unfortunately the folks at home can't, so
Yes.
let's get you a microphone.
Yes. Hi everyone. I'm sorry for interrupting, but
No,
I'm...
please do, but just tell us who you are.
Yes, my name is Ulyana Boychuk. I'm a freelance journalist from Ukraine. And actually, I have like a question. When work came to my country, I saw that a lot of my people of my country were sharing fake news through social media. Because there was like a 4 weeks, a month of the war, and people do not know whom to believe. And when we are talking about responsible journalism, and when we are talking that we journalists should be responsible for everything we are sharing to our auditory, do we think about is our auditory as knowledge enough about fake news, and do they understand how to be aware from fake news? Thank you.
Who'd like to give that a shot?
I'm happy to comment just very quickly. I don't think that's your responsibility as a journalist. I think your responsibility is to tell the story the way you think it needs to be told. If you're in business today, you can't worry about offending everybody. Find your audience, focus on them. Some people are going to attack you, you got to ignore them. And I think that just like I think Kerry said, some people are going to pull your article out of context, and it's not your job to worry about it. So in response to your question, I think journalists just do your job, how you think it needs to be done, go right down the middle if you can, and let the chips fall where they may as best you can. and let other people who are also have influential voices, maybe yourself if you're a guest on a show or something, provide that greater context to the social media world.
Yeah, I was thinking real quick, similar to what you said, once again, you do your work, you show your sources, as far as what you can show as far as sources are concerned, and what you can back up. People are gonna criticize you, people are always gonna criticize you, no matter how much people will even may accuse you of fake news, because people don't like what you are reporting. That being said, something I do wanna just mention here, as far as what has changed, is, in the last 10 years or so, because you mentioned the fact that everyone's a journalist now, we all have one of these here. Back in 2010, that was the mantra, remember? I mean, I recall Andrew Breitbart used to go around, saying, we all are journalists now, we all have iPhones and so on and so forth. But I do think though, what, people would say, hey, I was a citizen journalist, so on and so forth. What really did differentiate a journalist from someone who had an iPhone, be a citizen journalist, the fact that people who work for news organizations was that if you messed up, your job was at stake, okay? Or you get reprimanded, or you got a black mark there with your editor, and your job was on the line, okay? And someone who had a phone who went around up in someone's face, and even if they got like a really good story, even from like an iPhone and so on and so forth, and go viral, it would go on to one of the news networks, and whoa, citizen journalist, wow, did a great job, and so on and so forth. Maybe they did another story and it fell flat because, but what was the consequences? Nothing really, other than some like pride.
You just made a very good, point, Kerry, in that, yes, everybody had an iPhone, but the difference is that not everybody had an editor. And an editor helps you shape the story and holds you accountability. And we live in a world in which people are trying to escape accountability for what they do.
Exactly.
And part of that is fake news. I was lucky, Sean Waterman, who hosted the previous panel on generative AI, was my first editor at UPI and taught me a number of valuable lessons, and one of which was, if somebody's not mad at you for what you're writing, you're not doing a very good job.
Exactly. Exactly. So now, here we are, over a decade later, from the cry of everyone's a journalist, it's, well, gee, how can we hold people who go around saying everyone's a journalist accountable? And that is sort of the idea now of, well, we have to punish these people, and that goes back to what I was originally saying. Now it's the, government has to hold these people accountable. And because now we have these citizen journalists out there who are trying to put information out there, and they could be spreading fake news. This goes to a very recent case last month, Douglas Mackey. Okay, now this guy put out obvious fake news. Some people will call it criminal. What he did, it was criminal as far as DOJ said, because he put out a meme on Twitter saying that you can vote for Hillary Clinton through like texting, I believe it was, and he ended up getting sentenced to like, what was it, 5 months or so?
Yeah.
Okay. The Justice Department then being judged that that was election interference. Now, on one side, some people say that was a First Amendment right that he had, and that's horrible. The other side, some people will end up saying, wait, hold on a second here. What that's complete election interference, that's criminal, so on and so forth. But you see, that's like, once again, 10 years later from where's accountability to the citizen journalist.
But the issue of accountability, like you said, Peter, like you said, in the old times, or even today, in conventional media, you do have an editor who basically, culls the stories in terms of their strength and credibility. Problem is that there's a whole segment of the population that is no longer in that sphere, that is in the social media sphere. And unfortunately, and this is the real menace as far as I'm concerned, in the world of social media. It's not the good things that you say that grab people's attention, it's the bad things. And the step further from that, people know that that's the case, and they deliberately write wrong things so that they get as many views as possible. And that's the challenge that we are facing today.
I want to ask you a question on that, sir. You mentioned in your opening remarks Israel-Hamas war, right? This young woman mentioned a war in Ukraine. I was always in the online journalism world. I never worked for one of the traditional institutions. Where do you think the line is drawn between an editor who says, we need to teach the Americans something because we think they're, maybe I heard you say in your opening remarks, maybe some things are too pro-Israel, and some outlets maybe too pro-Israel. We need to teach them something at Al Jazeera that they don't already know. And maybe that makes you look pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas. Or on the flip side, do we fact check something that was claimed in the early part, like the Snake Island soldiers who told the big ship to go take a hike, shall we say, to use geoprograded language. Allegedly they were killed, turned out they were captured, right? So, but do we report that in the favorable way because we think Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression? Where's the line for you on this sort of reporting?
Yeah, it really is difficult to demarcate with a clear line those two worlds. It really is difficult to demarcate those two worlds with a clear line. You know, the problem is much more subjective, much more complicated than that. A large part of it depends on who the listener is. I'll give you an example. When I worked for public radio in Boston, public radio in Boston had a co-production with the BBC World Service, but it catered to an American audience. It didn't broadcast outside the US. And I remember from that time, many times we did stories about Israel-Palestine. And we did them in a way which we and our editors thought were well balanced. The balance was very carefully thought out. And the shock and the surprise was when we got listeners' mail, both Jews and Arabs listening to that show. Both are angry that we put the same, the two parties, the Israelis and the Palestinians, they would say, how dare you put the Israelis and the Palestinians in the same moral balance, depending on whether the writer is Jewish or Palestinian. So obviously, these are very, very thorny issues, and as I said, sometimes the judgment can be subjective, you know, changing from one editor to another. That line could change from one editor to another, even within the same news outlet.
Steve, did you have a thought you wanted to add? Because if not, we have a question.
Yeah, let me just very quickly say that I don't think traditional media and social media are mutually exclusive or the flip sides coins. You know, I work in very traditional media. I have a strong social media presence, and my social media presence is a reflection of my traditional media presence. I don't do hot takes. I don't give commentary. I rarely attempt humor online because even that gets very misinterpreted. And you know, I just want to make a full-throated defense for what you call the boring and tedious and these old-fashioned metrics of journalism. I understand what everybody else may be doing with opinion journalism and hot takes, and that's fine. There's space and room, and we have a First Amendment, and people can consume that. But you know, I've been very fortunate because I'm a former AP staffer, which is a news cooperative, ostensibly a nonprofit organization. And I've worked for a government-funded media that's also non-commercial. But to me, you know, the accuracy and the objectivity and the transparency about who we are equals credibility. And I think in the long term, that is something that's really valuable, especially in this age of all this misinformation, disinformation, and opinion journalism. Maybe it doesn't get the largest audience, but it has a role. And just like, you know, the New York Times, with, you know, it has flaws, right? But we all know what the New York Times is. and it's able to survive in a commercial environment. So I'm not sure that credible journalism has to be nonprofit or government funded, that there are commercial formula for this old-fashioned type of journalism too.
Sorry, can I
Yeah,
ask
go ahead.
a question? I'm just trying to put the intellectual cat among the pigeons here. I mean, for me, it's the same problem. Identifying what fake news is, identifying what responsible journalism is, and identifying what credibility is. I mean, if the metric for measuring credibility is the size of the audience, meaning numbers, well, you know, by that standard, Hitler had a lot of Germans supporting him. Is he credible? Big question. The same thing applies for the media. If you have a media outlet which has a huge popularity, and I know that the metrics, the audience metrics in the United States are not in the hundreds of millions, they are in the 2 million to 3 million mark. But if you have an outlet reporting on, let's say, Israel-Palestine in a particular way, and it garners an audience of 4 million, 5 million viewers, is that credibility? And if you say yes, then the question becomes credibility according to whom?
No, I agree with you that the numbers don't equal credibility, that it may be the smaller news organizations in terms of ratings. I mean, look at PBS, for example, definitely has probably for any evening daily newscast the lowest numbers, but where would you rank PBS's credibility compared to the cable networks especially?
Actually, just to even on a more micro level on this very similar argument goes back to when we were going through the pandemic. Because this argument was, because on social media, you had very, very credentialed scientists and doctors who were being told, oh, no, you can't say that about COVID. No, because according to the CDC, according to this government, according to that government, no, and they were being just written off. Now, we look back, of course, we said, oh, that's when he went quarterback, and we didn't know at the time, so I was like, yeah, but you just totally trashed these guys this entire time. It was a small group, but a lot of these guys, these well-known scientists, these well-known doctors over at these very prominent institutions were just being written off as kooks. So simply because they were a smaller group. So but because these massive media institutions were going along with what the government was saying, when the government was putting out, was actually regulating, now we know, social media, here we are today.
I think that's a very good point, Kerry. I'm glad you brought COVID up. But whether it was the discussion of masks or the potential for COVID to spread in the public school system, I do think that most of the mainstream media in America, and this is my opinion, took the position that masks, yes, schools closed, not because of the science, but because of political pressure applied by the federal government and by the states. And the science now tells us that masks probably didn't do very much good at all, and that the consequences to children of having their schools closed for 18 months is more severe than the risks that they would have been exposed to from COVID had they remained open. And so when we get into a situation like that, and I know you had a question on, I'll get to it, but what is the responsibility of news organizations when you get to the Monday morning quarterback position, and you're talking about COVID, or you're talking about the hospital in Gaza story that just about everybody got wrong initially? And we don't have to get into the reasons why they got it wrong, but they got it wrong and were slow to correct. What do we do about that? How do news consumers hold media organizations accountable without infringing upon, just from the US perspective, the First Amendment, which would have government sanctioning media companies for getting things wrong.
Well, I don't think the government should be, I don't think the government should be sanctioning news companies because they are slow to say, oops, sorry, we got it wrong. I mean, my goodness, it took the New York Times how many decades to say, well, wow, we got it wrong as far as World War II was concerned, as far as the Holocaust was a concern, because they didn't cover a whole lot there. I mean, it took a number of decades as far as that was concerned. But that being, but they finally did. That being said, we need to talk about, how they can better be transparent about it.
I think this goes back to the question of what is considered credible news, right? You have, I think, probably two broad categories. What does everybody believe? 200 years ago, black people, it's fine for black people to be slaves in America. 20 years ago, the current speaker was writing that marriage should be between a man and a woman, then the popular opinion. Today, that's considered right-wing and crazy. So you have the popular opinion credibility point, and then you have, I think what we're all trying to discuss here is the accurate reporting, investigative journalism type, and straight down the middle, straight news credibility. So to Kerry's point, I do tend to think that I think the journalists should resist, the government control in that way, or government pressure. I've never been in that role, so I can't speak to how I would respond to that kind of pressure, especially during a time like a COVID pandemic. But it does strike me that diving more deeply into, and I was never an investigative journalist. I tried it a few times, it didn't fit my personality, part of why I got into PR, 800 words versus 8,000. But at the same time, there was a study I covered once. It was on the effects of contraception on women. And the outlet I worked for, Catholic outlet, they basically covered the study. And I interviewed the woman who did the study. And it turns out the contraception that affected women the most negatively is of a specific type that is rarely used by women. So my job as a journalist, yes, was to, the headline from my editor was about this could hurt women. But the article dove into the interview and the reality of the study. So I do think that one of the failings of COVID was the question of what is the credibility of this study? What is the credibility of this person? Are they stepping outside of their lane? Are they not? If they are outside of their lane, why is that credible or not? So I think that was missed during COVID.
But I think one single answer to the question that you've raised now, I think it harks back to personal choice and responsibility. I mean, in the case of COVID, we all remember that there were American TV networks that were basically banning for the wearing of the mask and for the vaccine. And there were others who were completely against that. And if you're a viewer, you're watching CNN and Fox News, then should I do it or should I not do it? Where do I go? And ultimately it becomes your personal decision to go with the CNN factor, in that case, or the Fox News factor. You're gonna have to bear the consequences ultimately of your choice. There are a lot of people who were, back then, they were saying Fox News, for example, is not engaged in responsible journalism, so I will shun what it was telling me about COVID. There were others who were saying the CNNs of America should be shunned because of their reporting, their irresponsible reporting on COVID. But you cannot prove, the problem you cannot prove a negative. The government told us at that time that we should wear masks, right? Many of us felt that we could not afford, and obviously whatever Donald Trump or others said, they were echoed throughout CNN, Fox. Many of us felt that we could not afford to wait to see if the situation is actually otherwise. I'm pressed for time. I have this menace called virus. The government is telling me to wear a mask. I'm gonna wear a mask and see what happens. Now in hindsight, a lot of people are concluding, well, that was actually the responsible thing to do. But there were others also who were saying, like the example that Peter gave, my kids wasted a whole year of schooling because of a stupid decision made by the government and echoed through CNN, for example, through its irresponsible journalism. So, long story short, for me, what I'm saying is that ultimately it boils down to your personal choice and bearing the consequences of it.
But at the same time, you
Generally, Dustin, I'm sorry, as much as I'm enjoying this interchange, this gentleman has been waiting very patiently to ask a question, and I want to give him an opportunity to get in.
Thank you guys very much. It's been an incredibly engaging and
You are?
Oh, I'm Samson Boyer. I work for Dutco GR. This has been an incredibly interesting conversation, and I appreciate all of your time. I'm very concerned with the state of fake news in media, and I'm particularly concerned with how on social media especially, but also in old forms of media, it seems that the profit motive and the privatization of media has really been a disruptive factor and has increased and heightened the amount of fake news there is. We all know that if you publish something that might not be true, but gets people to click and creates that rage on social media, you'll get more views and hence the company makes more profit. So I'm curious, how has the privatization and for-profit model, in your view, affected the reliability of our news media? Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, that's an excellent question, and we'll go back, because I would throw that to you anyway, so you get to make the point you were going to make, and you can address the point that he's making.
the privatization of media. So, in the age of citizen journalism, right, we had, you remember the Covington Catholic circumstance 5.5, almost 6 years ago now? At least one, I don't remember the exact number of media outlets who had contributors, reporters and others saying things like, this 16-year-old kid who I'm watching for a 12-second clip has a punchable face. Or the New York Times reporters who were outraged that Senator Tom Cotton wanted to have an opinion at the New York Times. Or the number of journalists who, or say my age and younger, I'm 38, who think that the straight down the middle, as these more experienced journalists have discussed, more traditional journalists have pointed out, is of the old times. There used to be a point of view on climate change, abortion, immigration, Trump, Biden. Should we not talk about Biden's age because he's accomplishing a lot? Should we talk about it more because it's a legitimate concern of the public? I don't think the privatization of news is concerning in and of itself. We play, we have NPR on the background a lot of Saturday mornings. They'll touch on really good topics. But I have noticed a distinct lack of balance in how those conversations often take place, because it tends to be a little more liberal leaning. And so I think that the privatization isn't that concerning, because I, as a consumer, as you pointed out, can walk away from any outlet that I want to. And does that create distortion? To go back to our title here, yes, potentially, probably, but at the same time, more voices are better. The question is, do we as consumers have the ability and the intelligence to say, I'm seeing 10 different pieces of news, I only really care about that one. Okay, now I can dive more deeply. It really is at the end of the day. Do I think the journalism world has a lot of responsibility they're failing on? Yes. Do I think consumers have the end responsibility? Yes. So I'm not really worried about the privatization, because I think that would also lead to more government control.
Well, it's interesting, Dustin, you bring up the president's age. And I focus on, I would like to focus on that for just a second here. Because you made the assertion that people care about it, and I'm not sure that that's true. I think that reporters, opinion columnists, who are of a certain political persuasion, brought that issue to the American people and said, the president's almost 80 years old, he does this, he fell off his bicycle, he fell down the steps, he sometimes gets lost when he's thinking, or looks like he's lost when he's walking around on a presidential visit. Isn't this a bad thing? And they made people care about it. The issue is, should they have? And as distasteful as it may seem, I would argue that perhaps yes, that sometimes there are things that go on in the news cycle that it is the obligation of the commentariat as well as news reporters to go to the American people and say, we're thinking about this. We are specialists in this area, and we think this is important. I'll give another example. Abderrahim's network, Al Jazeera, has been criticized not for fake news, but for showing certain video clips that some Americans find horrific and offensive. And I would agree that for an American, some of those things are offensive, and they are certainly, as a human being, horrific. But they happen. They're news. And you have to make an editorial judgment about whether you want to put that story forward. And it doesn't necessarily, the fact that somebody sat down and said, let's make this a story, doesn't necessarily make it fake news. It doesn't necessarily discredit it. It may be the responsible thing to do.
Full disclosure, if I may. I listened to, going back to, private media, privatization. I listened to a lot of Rush Limbaugh, a lot. And I listened to him not because I thought that his ideas made sense to me. I listened to him because he's engaging, as opposed to NPR, the content of which is very good, or the BBC. I don't want to impugn anybody in particular. But the tone is not very engaging to a lot of Americans. They just tune out. Now that's one layer of it. Private radio has that engaging tone to it, and it brings viewers and it brings money and the rest of it. The dilemma that we have in terms of private as opposed to public, when you have a news outlet funded by a government, whether it's Al Jazeera or the BBC or Hora or whatever, that always raises the question of, oh, it's funded by a government. Could it possibly be credible? And in a lot of cases, yes, it can be credible. By the same token, private news outlets, because they are private and because the engine is money, they are about making money, they're not necessarily about making news, and they are engaging in everything. But how much leeway do you give them to influence you and influence your decisions? And again, I come back to the point that I made earlier. In a lot of cases, it boils down to your personal choice and your personal decisions, and whatever decision you make in terms of who you let influence you, you bear the consequences.
So, Kerry, how many articles a day do you write?
I love it when people ask me this question because, but it depends. Some days I can write up to 3 to 5 pieces. No, hold on a second. I see the look on your face. You're like, whoa! But other days I may write 1. Some days I may write 0. So because it depends. Because some days, I could be, I might grab about 3 or 5 press releases, and then I just go, bam, 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 wow, awesome. And then another day, I'll perhaps I'm like maybe 2 pieces because there's like a couple of votes on the floor, and then I can just grab a couple of lawmakers, boom, boom, no problem. Then I end up like today, I'm going to be talking to a person. It's going to be like a long form thing. I'll probably be talking to him for about 30 minutes or so.
and then I'll be writing it up tonight, and then it's gonna go out maybe tomorrow morning. So, it really ranges.
And the reason I asked that question is, let's say it's 3 a day on average, that's 15 stories a week. How many bills are introduced to Congress every year? Something like 6,000? So right there is, you have a responsibility as a journalist, right, to the audience. It's just 15 stories we can't possibly cover 6,000 bills or however many hundreds of committee hearings. And, you know, Steve, you're VOAs in how many different languages?
Including English and learning English, 48 at present.
And so again, to the question of the responsibility of journalists, how can you possibly cover, as an organization, everything that happens in all of those languages? I think that's a question that often gets ignored in the social media storm, is yes, you're gonna have to make, as you said, responsible choices. The editor is going to be involved in that process. I think that's a lack of consumer education on, wow, there are, you know, how many of us know that the invasion of Armenia that was at risk, that Politico reported on 3 weeks ago? I practically missed it. Because it's less important than Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas. I'm not a foreign affairs person.
It's a big story at VOA.
But it's a big story.
Yeah, well, Jazeera.
And so I do think that a lot of times, the American consumer gets so caught up in a punchable face, or claims about this and claims about that, and what did Trump say today, what did Biden mess up on today? We miss those big stories. They're really important stories around the world and even domestically, but we get so caught up in what feels and looks good to us.
Oh, I thought you were. All right, well, we talked around, we talked a lot about responsibility, and we talked a lot about misunderstanding and inaccuracies, but, you know, the elephant in the room is the stories that have dominated the media cycle here in the United States for the last 9 years, that were wholly without merit, but drove public policy conversations. And I know that there's a belief among some people that the term fake news was originally going to be used to discredit news stories that ran counter to the conventional narrative on a host of public policy issues. But the term got hijacked by the former president, Donald Trump, who just decided to label any story that he didn't like fake news. In his defense, because this is America and everyone is entitled to a defense, some of the stories he complained about were fake, particularly the stories about his behavior that were, I'll say revealed, but there's got to be a better word, in the dossier prepared by the former British intelligence officer working for a firm, a research firm that had ties to Democratic law firms and to the Clinton campaign.
But it was a two-way street. He fed a lot of
And
fake stories
he did absolutely, but that one story alone, the Steele dossier story, drove the U.S. political conversation for 2 years.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of people who questioned the validity of the dossier when it was first published on BuzzFeed. They read it and said, this doesn't smell right, this doesn't make sense, and yet there was nobody interested, or very few people interested in the mainstream. They just wanted to say, hey, you know, we're just following the story, we're just covering the story. At what point are you not just covering the story, but aiding and abetting the dissemination of fake news just because it's something people are talking about? And I'm just picking the Steele dossier story because I think it's the meta example. It is the big thing. There are plenty of other stories where that make other politicians and people of all political persuasions look bad. I just think this is the meta example that everybody knows, so it should be the easiest one to talk about.
You know, Peter, if I may say, you know, like in the early days of computers, they had this expression, garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yep.
And he, even before he became president, first of all, Donald Trump, even before he became president, he garbaged a lot of stories into the news cycle during his campaign. You know, we can go through a whole litany of those. And then the media started to also garbage a lot of stuff in about him. But you look, for me, there's a bigger issue here at play, and it is a conundrum. And the issue is the menace that is 24-hour television. You know, we live in a world where it has become inconceivable not to have 24-hour television, 24-hour news cycle. We are caught up in it, not just as human beings, but as a profit quality. It's about money. It has become part of our economy, part of our social life, part of our existential DNA. Because we cannot get out of it, it has become a menace. You mentioned how many stories of consequence to foreign policy have we lived through the last 9-10 years? How many do we even remember? I don't even remember, and I'm in the news business. Yeah, if I can count 10, I think I would be very lucky. And I'm from within the business, let alone somebody who's outside the business. So this business of the news cycle, you know, it fully connects into the issue that we're discussing here: responsible as opposed to irresponsible journalism, and fake journalism as opposed to real. You cannot convince me that in a 24-hour news cycle, you can fill every single minute of those 24 hours with responsible journalism. You just cannot convince me that that's possible.
I think it's important to point out here, keep in mind, that with the advent of a 24-hour news cycle and the internet, you have this very fluid sort of dissemination of news that's been going on at least since about, let's just say, mid-80s going forward. Yes, I know CNET's been around longer, but still. Previously, you had the big three networks, and you had the papers, radio, okay? What would happen, because fake news, as you mentioned, has been around forever. But what happened is, you get the newspaper, if fake news is there, okay, whatever, paper's gone. You know, news in, news out. Watch TV, if fake news came out, okay, news in, news out. It was relatively kind of in and out. The thing now, with the internet, as well as constant news cycle, is that you're constantly seeing it, you're constantly reminded of it. And on top of that, as opposed to our good old libraries where perhaps you have some like real nerd who go into like, look something up. Oh, look at that, I found a clip here that someone said something one day and then said something the other day,
You
okay?
had to look for it on microfilm.
You actually have to look it over on the microfiche, okay? Okay, but like, that was like maybe one person in a million. Now, everyone's lazy now and they can all go look at it on Google, okay? It's like a global crowdsourcing, and that pisses everybody off. And therein lies the big difference of where we are today as opposed to where we were back in like the early 90s going backwards. And therein lies the big issue.
You went, in the old days, you went to microfiche, as you said, and you found the facts.
Microfiche,
It was-
big books
Yeah.
with months' worth of
And
newspapers
they were facts.
in one of them.
And they were facts. Today you go to something like Wikipedia, for example. How reliable is Google? Like anybody can write anything about anything.
You type something into a search engine and go with the first thing that comes up.
Yeah.
hence media literacy.
Yes.
And I was gonna say that. You can find anything on Google, and we spend, in my case, I spend it watching action films, on YouTube instead of looking up these gentlemen who I didn't know before today, probably could have known them on YouTube. And so I'm as guilty of it as anybody, but I do think at the end of the day, again, I mentioned earlier, there's two different sides of the path. There's the journalism to the consumer. There's also the consumer who sees something and says, I'm gonna go look it up. And then looks up to the original source. And that's what's really critical. What do you care about? Can you impact it? Why do you care about it? Then let's go either wait a couple of days and look at this news cycle again on this particular matter, or go to the original source. It doesn't have to be a library anymore, it's Google, which I think is beneficial, but, how do I pronounce your name again, sir?
Abderrahim.
What he said? Abderrahim. Yeah. I'm sorry. But as you pointed out, it is very much the case that when you try to do that, it's hard to get there. It's hard to get there till they get past the noise.
Yes.
Steve, let me ask you, does confirmation bias play a role in dissemination of fake news in your opinion? And if it does, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I use that phrase a lot to explain why people are behaving as they are online, especially with Facebook. And I would hazard to say I don't have any scientific data to back this up, but my guess is that there's a percentage of people who maybe really don't care whether it's true or not. They just want to have their views validated and share that with other people. This is outside my professional area. I'm a journalist, I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist, but my impression, yes, it's quite huge that confirmation bias plays a very big role in this now.
And Dustin, is that something that outside actors can manipulate to for monetary benefit? And do that?
Yes and yes, because if you get 1 billion clicks to something that isn't true, then you make money off of it, and you're seen as credible. We talked earlier about the different types of credibility. People believing you in the actual facts.
Yeah.
You mentioned Hitler, and a lot of people believed him. That created credibility for him with a lot of people.
Yes.
What's Andy Warhol, when he talked about fame, how much? 15 minutes of fame. But if you lived in the time of the iPhone, I mean, now we can have 24 hours of fame if we want it. We can be constantly dishing out stuff, regardless whether it's true or not, because we want to be famous.
But on the flip side too, as you said, you're in the business and you can think of 10 stories in the last decade on foreign affairs. At the end of the day, you might be famous for 24 hours and you are probably forgotten.
Well, that's an interesting point. Somebody told me the difference between having ADHD as an adult and a child is that when you're a child, you can't pay attention to anything. When you're an adult, you can't stand it when people aren't paying attention to you. And I think that does drive a lot of the conversation. And I also think that I would say, having covered politics in Washington now for a long time, that I've seen politicians deliberately leak misleading or obviously dishonest information to drive stories. That accuracy, and reporters ended up substituting accuracy for advocacy. And that they were used and manipulated by politicians and by other people who have elite social status to drive agendas. And that I think we would all agree, and if you don't agree with me, please say so, that we have that responsibility as journalists to question our stories, to question everything, even the things that come from trusted sources, because we are vulnerable to manipulation, and it is the responsible thing to do because we are gatekeepers, and in that sense, I think that at least in the Western media tradition, we're not allowed to just put things out there, coming full circle to where we started. We're not allowed to just put things out there and say, well, you know, I just report. You know, what people think, what people do, how they take that information, that's not my responsibility. I think that is something you have to consider.
I think you're wrong, Peter. If a president of the United States or the press secretary says something, how many articles get run on, said Obama, said Trump, said, you know, all these different people. So actually that responsibility is been kind of reneged on, because you can say, well, I was just told that.
I get dinged on, or when I was more active on Twitter, I get dinged a lot because I would be in the Oval Office as a pool reporter, and I'm putting out a quote of what the president said, okay? Whatever party that president was from. And I would get criticized for putting out that tweet and not putting the comment in context, because obviously the president was lying, according to other people. We say journalism is the first draft of history. Well, in a lot of cases, reporting on social media is the first draft of journalism. And I would tell people, these are not news stories. It is accurate. This is a direct quote of what the president just said. If it's significant, it will be put into context in a news story.
You know, for us, journalists here in DC, we obviously have the privilege, especially those who cover politics, we have the privilege of being up close. We cover the White House, the Congress, places where politicians make decisions. That's a huge privilege. But we also run the risk of getting too close to the source of the privilege. And, you know, to what you were saying earlier, I mean, just think about what the New York Times did in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. What's her name, the famous New York Times correspondent? Judith Miller, who basically became a paste and copy correspondent for what the Bush administration was trying to do in Iraq. We don't all have to be like that, and obviously not every journalist in DC has that. There are really outstanding examples of real investigative journalism of one format or another, but the risk for us all is obviously there.
These, you bring up an excellent point, these, the coziness or the cover-ups here in Washington are nothing new. I was doing research for a book that's going to be published next year that delves into reporting presidents going all the way back.
You can give it a plug if you want.
Behind the White House curtain. It comes out in June. You can pre-order now. Yeah, QR code. By the way, George Washington's second term, he was just really having fits because he was being beaten up by the media so badly. But Roosevelt in a wheelchair, no photographs of that came out. JFK, you can argue whether his womanizing affected his presidency, but he had very serious health problems. And we made fun of, during the Trump era, the medical reports that were coming out of the White House. If you saw the list of prescription drugs that JFK was using and abusing as president, I wonder if he would have got elected to a second term, or would he have lived through a second term? So this is nothing new in Washington.
Which also leads back to the point of distorted journalism is not today's age unless we're gonna go back a really long time.
Can I just ask a
Yes,
question?
please. Stand up, tell us who you are, and I will, okay, we'll get you the microphone so the folks can hear you at home. Hold it like a lollipop or an ice cream cone, so it's close to your mouth.
Like a lollipop.
And open my mouth. Okay, my name is Langipoima Sherelle Jackson. I'm the Global Climate Collaborations Editor for AP. But I'm originally from Samoa in the South Pacific, so most of my journalism has taken place in the Global South, in which I make this observation.
And you're one of our award winners, and we want to prematurely
Thank you.
congratulate you on that.
Thank you. But very interesting to hear the different perspectives, and I definitely see why you switched to PR, because you like to talk. But I really appreciate the different perspectives here, and I think what I wanted to share is I only migrated to the US 3 years ago. So my primary way I received news about the US was, CNN, BBC, and some Google News articles here and there, but through social media. And this was, so when I left Samoa, this was like height of Trump era, right? And so arriving here and observing how the media reported, what I found interesting, and I'd love to hear your perspective, the journalist, on this one, is how, you have the obligation to tell the truth and to report on leaders. That makes the news, that is what you're supposed to do, especially if you're covering the White House or Capitol. But when it came to Trump, 90% of the things that were said were absolutely untrue.
By him or about him?
By him, like his quotes, his speeches, things that he was saying were inaccurate. And so I found this, the obligation of the journalists in the US to report on what the president said, right? You had to do that. But then where was your judgment call as a journalist about the mistruths and the misinformation? So that's where, I'm very, Steve, especially for you, seeing as how you reported extensively on that, there was a line there, right? That was not really observed by journalists, because you were just reporting on what he was saying. And I feel like the fact-checking aspect of Trump's commentary came much later, a bit too late, in terms of some of the stuff he was saying. But journalists were just reporting freely on everything he was saying, irrespective of whether or not it held any truth. So where did you sit in that space mentally? Like, you had to report on what the president was saying, but at the same time, there was inaccuracy. So I'd love to hear how you navigated that hard space. And also, Al Jazeera, love your coverage, that comes across the Pacific. How did you treat that from the global perspective as well? Thank you. I know that was long, sorry.
It's an excellent question. And I think what happened at the beginning of the Trump administration is a lot of journalists were shell-shocked because, okay, this is the President of the United States. And the other thing was there was a huge volume of material coming out every day. And you really had, you would start to work on one story and then he would say something else. And again, we were hostages to some degree to the 24-hour news cycle because, new editors and newsrooms were going with whatever was, flashing across the screen on Fox or MSNBC or CNN. But, and I, read my book because I do go into some of this in detail because.
Steve, let me just interject here. It's buy my book, then read it.
You can get it at the library.
Free copy, thanks.
But I'll give you one brief example. Early on in the Trump administration, remember, there's some scrutiny of VOA even early on because we're part of the US government, funded by the government, although there's a firewall between us and the executive branch of the administration as far as our journalistic content. But remember when Trump as president, called the media the enemy of the people?
Yeah.
Okay, now, we have, as I said, 48 language services. This was getting a lot of play. I thought it was really important to put that phrase into context. And so Jeff Selden, covers national security for us, and I teamed up, and we did a story, probably ran, 1,200 words or something like that, about the historical context, and basically saying that the President of the United States, by calling the media the enemy of the people, is bringing up a Stalinist phrase, and enemies of the people traditionally ended up in the gulag or worse. And I was waiting to see how our audiences would react to us doing the story, and also the executive branch. And, I don't know what sort of criticism there was, but we did do that story very early on in the Trump administration.
It's been so long, I don't even remember how it happened.
You've locked it up.
Somebody
You had me on a lot to translate.
We did, but you know, like one big, for an international broadcaster as opposed to American news outlets, one big, I mean, we had an advantage, obviously, we're based here in DC, we get into the nitty-gritty of American politics, we translate the American political system all the time to our viewers outside the United States, so that's a huge gain. The challenge that we had was, by the way, I want to challenge a little bit the veracity of what you said, that the media in the US didn't challenge Donald Trump. I think it's precisely because they challenged him that he called them, you know, fake news and the enemy of the people. I mean, the New York Times, you can go to the New York Times, the Washington Post and others challenging Donald Trump as early as his presidential election. But the challenge that we faced as an international broadcaster coming out of DC is there was a lot of anonymous stuff in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. It was amazing stuff, but it was anonymous stuff. So quoting it was a problem. Not quoting it, people would accuse you of not being truthful, or being afraid to report it. And there was a constant debate within the network at that time how to report anonymous news in the American press. I mean, we knew, obviously, New York Times, Washington Post, they do have, in terms of the manpower, they have a lot of people working within the administration to get to anonymous news. We didn't always have our own people getting those anonymous scoops. So that was just one example of the challenge that we had from that time. The rest, I don't remember.
That also, though, and I'm glad you brought that up, was a major problem. Even though I am largely in the opinion space, I, with very few exceptions, will not quote somebody if they are not willing to go on the record. And there was a plethora of people who were happy, even inside the administration, who were happy to say horrible things about the president, but they wouldn't quit, and they wouldn't put their name on what they were saying, and those stories drove the news. And it doesn't do the journalism industry any good to keep reporting on anonymous criticisms, because as my other colleagues at UPI taught me earlier, who are they? What's their beef? Do they have an axe to grind? Is there something personal here, professional, sexual, financial? You gotta, and this goes back to the first impeachment, when everybody in town and everybody in the news industry was falling over backwards to protect the anonymity of the whistleblower who complained about Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine. I do not remember a time when a whistleblower had the kind of impact that this whistleblower did, that every reporter in Washington who wasn't writing about the whistleblower was trying to find out who they were, going back to Deep Throat and the Watergate scandal. Because that was news, but all of a sudden, this whistleblower was off the table, unusually.
And Peter, I'd like to point out
And
that.
Kerry worked on that story, so
Yeah.
you may have some details that you want to add about who
Yeah.
the person might have been.
Yeah, in fact, it got so bad to the point where lawmakers knew this guy's name. And you had Adam Schiff, who was the Intel chair at the time, and he would not allow Republican lawmakers to even say this man's name during any of the behind the door hearings. Oh, no, you can't say it, or you're gonna be, reprimanded or punished, or whatever the case may be. That's how bad it got. So, and the media, they went out of their way to keep this guy's name, can't say it, Whereas in the past, with whistleblowers, oh, we gotta find out who this whistleblower is, and we're gonna make sure we're gonna expose this whistleblower's name. I mean, it was all about getting the names of whistleblowers, but with this particular whistleblower, oh, we're gonna make sure that we're gonna cover his name. That's what it's all about at the time.
There was something similar going on in the White House during the Trump administration. We would hear, a small group of reporters would hear something from a senior administration official off the record, okay? Off the record has a very specific meaning. And then the next day in certain publications or on certain broadcasts, that quote would be there on background attributed to a senior administration official. So that was a challenge too. Were you willing, and in some cases with Trump himself on Air Force One, he would say things that were off the record, and then one of the pool reporters would say, Mr. President, that part you just said about Adam Schiff or somebody like that, could you go on the record? And he would say, much to the horror of the press secretary, oh yeah, sure. So things were very fungible in the previous administration about the traditional boundaries of how information was sourced. And a lot of that was good because we would get the president to go on the record instead of being off the record.
Did you have something you wanted to add? No. Okay. Well, we're at time, and if nobody in the audience has any more questions, I would like you please to thank them all with a warm round of applause. You'll be excellent at good tips of either kind. We are journalists after all. A fake hat and fake tips. But thank you very much. You've indulged us in our vanity. We appreciate it greatly, and we hope you leave the room a little bit better informed about the responsibilities of journalism in an era of fake news. Thank you for your attention. Please enjoy your coffee.